Welcome to the Sendy Mom Podcast. I'm Becky, and this is the Sendy Spotlight, a bonus episode where I get to talk about Sendy women from history who have been brave.
I'm Becky Brower, and I'm a Sendy Mom. Welcome to the Sendy Mom Podcast.
I'm pretty brave in some ways, but I really wish I was more brave in standing up for myself, in speaking out about what I believe. It's actually kind of hard to be honest and to be kind. I'm learning how to do that as I interview women on the podcast, and I learn it from some amazing women from history who weren't perfect, but learned to be brave for so many reasons. I'm learning that bravery doesn't always mean speaking out and speaking up. Sometimes it means preserving thoughts and sharing quietly with humility and with patience. My Sendy Spotlight today had to wait for 200 years before her words came to light. And it has only been after about 650 years that they are more widely known. Today, I want to take you back to 14th century England. So imagine a world where the Black Plague has killed nearly half the people you know, where women are not allowed to speak theology, where the church holds the power of life and death, and anyone who dares to contradict it risks being labeled a heretic. In that world, a 30-year-old woman lay dying in her bed. She had even asked for death. Her near-death experience changed the course of English spiritual literature forever. This is the story of Julian of Norwich. To understand how courageous Julian was, you have to understand the world she was born into. Julian was born around 1342 in Norwich, England, which at the time was the second largest city in England. She grew up during one of the most devastating eras in human history. The Black Plague, or the bubonic plague, arrived in England in 1348 when Julian was about 5 or 6 years old. By the time it had run its course, it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. Entire villages were wiped out. Families simply disappeared, and then it came back. In 1361, when Julian was about 18 or 19, the plague returned. Historians believe she may have lost not only family members and friends, but as a woman of that time, she was probably married around age 15 and started raising a family. So she might have also lost a husband and children. So COVID was really hard on a lot of people, but at least we had some knowledge of what was attacking us and some hope that science might catch up. Medieval Europeans had none of that. What they faced wasn't just fear of death, but a complete collapse of the frameworks that made death bearable. Community, sacrament, explanation, hope. The plague didn't just kill people for a time, it really unmade the world. They assumed people with the disease must have deserved their punishment for some reason, and families really fell apart. The theology of the day was heavy with sin and punishment. God was to be feared. He was very real and very close. The church wasn't just an institution, it was the moral framework of the society. In this environment, women were to be silent and subservient. Most were not allowed to read and write. Julian describes herself as a simple creature, unlettered, living in deadly flesh. They were not theologians. They were not writers. They certainly were not prophetesses with revelations from God. This is the world Julian was born into, and she would spend her life gently, quietly, and completely turning it upside down. When Julian was 30 years old, she desired her spirituality to be intensified. She wanted knowledge and had faith that if she asked in prayer, she would be answered. Personal revelation is real, and it has been exercised by millions of faithful people throughout the centuries. I believe God still speaks to his children. Believing this has made my life so much more fulfilling and purposeful. If you want some suggestions on how to have more meaningful communication with deity, go to the conversation I had with Brittany Barney in episode 40. Brittany's also written a book called Becoming a Mighty Prayer, which I really recommend. It has lots of great examples of communing with God. Julian prayed for specific experiences that would take her to the next level of spirituality. Be careful about praying for a mountain to climb. I admire her, though, for being brave enough to ask. She prayed for three things. First, to understand and feel the suffering of Christ, to truly enter into what he had gone through. Second, to have a sickness so severe she would feel as if she was going to die, so that it would strip away anything that was not of God. And third, to receive three wounds in her soul: contrition, compassion, and a steadfast longing toward God. Who prays for that? Only someone who is deeply, desperately hungry for God. Only someone willing to go to the edge of themselves to find him. And God answered. On May 13th, 1373, Julian became gravely ill. She was 30 years old. She later noted it as the same age Jesus left carpentry to start his ministry. For 3 days, she lay sick. Her priest came and read her last rites. Her family gathered around her, believing she was dying. And then, beginning at 4 in the morning and then lasting until about 9 that morning, and with one final showing that night, Julian received 16 visions. She called them showings of Jesus Christ. She described what she saw with stunning detail. She saw a hazelnut small in the palm of her hand and was told, "This is all that is made." She marveled how something so small could last and was given the answer, "It lasts and ever shall last, for God loves it." She saw Christ's suffering in vivid detail. She saw colors and light. She heard words spoken to her soul. And through all of it, she received a message so radical for the time, so countercultural for her time, that she spent the next 20 years trying to fully understand it. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. After her recovery, Julian became an anchoress. An anchoress was a woman who voluntarily entered a small cell attached to the outside wall of a church, and she never left, like never. She took vows of poverty, chastity, and what was called stability of abode. She vowed to stay in that room for the rest of her life, as in not a walk in a forest, not to a friend's house. She had servants that would give her food and take care of her. And she had a little window that opened to the street where people could come and talk with her. And then she had a window out to the church where she could kind of participate in services. But largely, she was alone in her cell all the time. I can't even imagine. There was a formal ceremony for this. It was essentially a funeral. She was sealed into her cell. The church performed last rites over her. She was, in the eyes of the world, dead. She lived in that cell for 40 to 50 years after she was sealed in it, until her death, which was sometime after 1416. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That doesn't really sound courageous. That sounds like hiding. But I want to challenge that. In a world where women had no public voice, where the church would silence anyone who spoke out of turn, where a woman with visions could be tried as a heretic, Julian found a legal, protected space to think freely. As an anchoress, she was under the protection of the church. She had access to books. She had time to think and write, and people came to her. She had influence. She felt called to her life of contemplation, and she trusted God with all she had to offer. She called herself a simple creature that could not read, but historians believe this was protective humility because this woman wrote. She wrote what scholars believe is the first book written in English by a woman. I'm going to get into the revelations a little. Most of them were pictures of Christ and his suffering, but there were some beautiful anecdotal teachings as well, with stories illustrating God's love and his plan for us. These were not just regurgitations of what the church had taught. These revelations revealed a very different God than the fire and brimstone God preached in the Catholic Church at the time. Julian's theology was, for her time, dangerous. She saw no hell for the saved. She wrote that God has no wrath toward his children, only toward sin itself. She wrote that God does not blame us for our failures any more than he blames the servant who fell in a ditch while running an errand for his master. She had this beautiful vision of a Lord and a servant. The servant runs eagerly to do his master's will, falls into a ditch, and cannot get up. And the Lord, rather than being angry, looks on him with tenderness and compassion. Julian saw in this whole story of Adam, of humanity, God is not our judge waiting to condemn us. God is our Lord, longing to bring us home. This was not a popular view for people that felt the only way to motivate people was through fear. Why would you obey a God who wanted you around and liked you for who you were? It just wasn't part of the parenting strategy. Okay, I want to get a little bit into parenting because there's actually been some misunderstanding for centuries about how to motivate children. And here's me being a little bit courageous and saying something that might be a little unpopular. I don't think punishment is an effective way to teach children. Do not misunderstand me. I think consequences are important and we all get to experience those. I think it's important for parents to enforce some consequences, but that is very different from punishment. Punishment is something you do as a parent to your child. Consequences are things that happen when a child makes a choice. That gives the power to the person making the choice. If you punish your child, you are the villain and they are the victim. If there are consequences, they have the power to change those consequences. You may say it's just semantics, but let me give you an example. When I was young, we had a room in our house that was called the automatic spanking room. If we went into that room, we would get an automatic spanking. I do not want you to think that my parents were monsters. They are the most loving and kind people on the planet. But 50 years ago, that's just kind of what they did. And that's what they were taught, how to be an effective parent. I actually think that my younger siblings were spared that when my parents learned that that just wasn't effective in training children. This is an example of punishment, and it's a pretty easy one to pick out as punishment. Another example that is maybe less severe is when a parent says, you can't go out with your friends or drive a car or watch TV because you didn't clean up your mess or because you didn't do XYZ on your list. This is what I call the Cinderella effect. This also makes your child the victim and you the perpetrator. Although it sounds perfectly reasonable, it is a form of control that takes the responsibility from the child and is viewed as punishment. Consequences, on the other hand, reframes the behavior to be within the child's control. It shows trust in the child. You, as the parent, recognize that they have just fallen into a pit. You are looking at them lovingly and you're wanting for them to ask for help or to begin figuring out a way to get out of that pit. Instead of telling them they can't do something unless they do what you say, try asking them what their plan is for the day. Talk to them about what needs to be done and telling them that as soon as they get those things done, they can go play. Then you can ask them how you can help them get through the things that they need to get done. I find I worry so much less if I know my kids have a plan. I hate coming up with things for them to do when they're bored because I have no idea what they should do, but they do. When children are little, I think there does need to be some structure, but just reframe the way you present it to your kids so they feel like they're in control of the consequences. Remember that it is better to have small consequences when you're little than large consequences when you're bigger. Saying something that indicates a reward, like, when you make your bed, I'll put a chocolate on it, or that gives them decision power, like, what would make it easier for you to get to bed on time so you're not so tired in the morning will be much more productive than yelling at them. I believe this is one of the lessons from Julian's revelations. God is not waiting for us to sin so he can punish us. He is waiting for us to sin so we can turn to him and feel comfortable asking for help because we know he isn't punishing us and we can trust him. Julian also wrote about God as our mother, not just as a father. She wrote, as truly as God is our father, so truly is God our mother. She spoke of Jesus as a mother who nurses, comforts, and carries us. I believe God is the Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother combined. Maybe not in one personage, but certainly in purpose and love. And perhaps most scandalously for her time, she wrote that sin is not the worst thing, that God does not despair over sin, but uses it to bring us closer to him. She says, It behooved that there should be sin, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. In the 14th century, to write that all shall be well, when the church was preaching fear and condemnation, was an act of extraordinary courage. She was careful. She always affirmed her loyalty to the church, but the content of what she wrote was pretty revolutionary. Here's a part of the story I find breathtaking. Julian finished her long text, or the expanded version of her vision, sometime in the 1410s or 1420s. The first published copy didn't appear until 1670. That's over 200 years later. Why? Because her work was dangerous. And when Henry VIII broke from Rome in 1534 and dissolved the monasteries, most Catholic manuscripts, including many copies of Julian's writings, were destroyed. But 9 Benedictine nuns fled to France. These were educated women. They carried what they could. Fragments of Julian's work were transcribed in their library. Then the French Revolution swept through, and much of what they had preserved was lost again. And yet, her words survived, not in one perfect manuscript, not in her own handwriting, but in copies made by women who knew the words were too important to lose. Women protecting women's wisdom across centuries. A medieval art historian named Dr. Janina Ramirez has called Julian the mother of English prose. She's been compared to Chaucer, and yet for centuries she was barely known. It took courage for Julian to write. It took courage for women across centuries to copy and preserve her words. And now we get to read them. All right, I want to bring this home to our lives today. Julian lived in a world designed to make her feel small, a world that had taken enormous amounts from her, possibly her family, her health, her freedom, and yet she had the audacity to believe that all would be well, not because the evidence around her supported that belief, but because she had seen something she could not unsee. Here are the things I keep coming back to from her life. First, courage doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Julian chose to stay. She sat and contemplated her visions for 20 years before she was done writing about them. She didn't rush. She didn't publish immediately. She didn't worry that she was too late or that her work wouldn't matter. She let the truth marinate until she understood it. In a culture that rewards speed, that is counterculture courage. Second, you don't have to have credentials to say something. Julian called herself a simple, unlettered creature. She wrote anyway. Her insights about prayer, about love, about the nature of God have outlasted over 650 years. You don't need to be something in the eyes of the world before you leave your mark on the world. Your experience is your credential. Third, protective humility is not the same as hiding your light. Julian was strategic. She stayed within the system while stretching it from the inside. She was loyal to the church while saying things the church wasn't ready to hear. There's a wisdom in knowing when to be bold and when to be quiet, and she knew the difference. Some people choose to leave the establishment, but some choose to stay. Neither is wrong, but there can be good from shining a light from within. Fourth, all shall be well is a choice, not a guarantee. Julian didn't write these words because her life was easy. She wrote them in the middle of a plague, loss, suffering, and isolation. She chose to believe in the goodness of God, even when the world offered no evidence for it. That is not naivety. That is radical, muscular faith. And here's another thing that I believe that you might not agree with. I have been thinking a lot about suffering lately. So I believe that trials are not optional, but suffering is. We all have trials in our lives. Nobody can truly say that someone has it worse than another by looking in. Viktor Frankl, who was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, wrote in The Man's Search for Meaning, To draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus, suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. Whatever size chamber you allow for the suffering will be filled with suffering. Viktor Frankl also says, in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. I believe he is saying that once you find meaning in the suffering, you will suffer far less. It really is how you view it. To God, the whole human race is represented by that servant ready to do his Lord's bidding, and yet falling and injuring himself in the process. The servant had all the best intentions. It isn't his fault that he fell, although he might think it is or blame somebody else for the fall. Either way, God is still viewing his servant with love, and he's reaching out to heal him. It is how we view that trial or fall that makes all the difference. Viktor Frankl spoke of the ability to choose our own story when he said, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Julian of Norwich once wrote, wouldst thou learn thy Lord's meaning in this thing? Learn it well. Love was his meaning. Who showed it thee? Love. What showed he thee? Love. Wherefore showed it he? For love. Hold thee therein, and thou shalt learn and know more in the same. Love. Viktor Frankl said something similar. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers, the truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love. That's really what it comes back to, right? Love was an anchor to Julian in a century of catastrophe. Love was the message she was willing to be buried alive to write down. Love was what she spent 30 years in a single room contemplating, never knowing who might be influenced by those scribblings. What would it look like for you to be anchored in love the way Julian was? What would it change about the risks you are willing to take, the truths you're willing to speak? I'll leave you with her most famous words, words that give hope and peace when the trials do come and that relieve suffering. I hope you carry them with you this week. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Thank you for listening to the Sendy Mom podcast today. If this episode moved you, please share it with someone who needs a little borrowed courage today. And I'll see you next time.
In the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, do something every day that scares you.